In the hush of autumn's twilight, where the leaves whispered their farewells to the boughs, Elias wandered the cobblestone paths of Eldridge Hollow. At 64, his steps had grown deliberate, each one a measured echo of the years that had etched fine lines upon his brow and a quiet ache within his chest. He was a man of letters, retired from the dusty halls of the university library where he had once curated forgotten tomes, their pages yellowed like the memories he now sifted through in solitude. The house on Willow Lane, with its sagging porch and garden overrun by wild roses, had been his sanctuary for decades. But lately, it felt more like a vessel adrift, its rooms filled with the ghosts of unspoken words. Elias would sit by the window, his spectacles perched on the bridge of his nose, watching the world soften into evening. And there, across the narrow lane, lived Miriam. She was 58, a widow with hair the color of burnished copper, streaked now with silver threads that caught the light like fleeting stars. Miriam tended her herb garden with a grace that seemed borrowed from another era, her fingers coaxing life from the soil as if whispering secrets to the earth. Elias had known her for 20 years, first as the wife of his old colleague, then as the quiet companion in grief after the accident claimed her husband. They shared nods over fences, cups of tea on rainy afternoons, conversations that meandered like lazy rivers through literature and loss. But love, that elusive bird, had perched upon Elias's heart unbidden. It began subtly, a warmth in his gaze when she laughed at his dry wit, a flutter when her hand brushed his while passing a saucer. He imagined her as a poem unfinished, her eyes holding verses he longed to decipher. In the quiet hours, he composed letters in his mind, declarations wrapped in metaphors of fading seasons and enduring oaks, yet they remained sealed within him, fragile as pressed flowers. One crisp October morning, mist clung to the hollow like a lover's reluctant embrace. Elias crossed the lane, a basket of apples from his tree in hand, their skins blushed with the hue of unspoken desire. Miriam opened the door, her smile a gentle dawn breaking through clouds. "Elias, how thoughtful," she said, her voice a melody of time and memory. They sat in her kitchen, the air scented with brewing chamomile, and talked of books, of Austen's restrained passions, of Eliot's intricate webs of fate. As the steam rose from their cups, Elias felt the words rise too, a tide pulling at his resolve. "Miriam," he began, his voice a tremor in the stillness, "these years, they've woven something in me, a thread that leads back to you." Her eyes met his, soft with understanding, yet shadowed by a veil he could not pierce. She placed her hand over his, not in reciprocity, but in the tender mercy of friendship. "Dear Elias," she murmured, "you've been my anchor in this quiet sea. But my heart, it lingers still with what was lost. It blooms in the past, not in new gardens." The words hung between them, delicate as spider silk, unbroken yet unbinding. Elias nodded, the ache blooming like a bruise beneath his ribs, subtle, persistent, a companion he had come to know well. He rose, the basket lighter now, and stepped into the chill air, where the leaves swirled in eddies at his feet. That evening, as the sun dipped below the hills, painting the sky in strokes of amber and regret, Elias sat by his fire. The flames danced shadows across the walls, mirroring the flicker of emotions he cradled within. Love, he reflected, was not always a symphony of mutual chords. Sometimes it was a solitary sonnet, etched in the soul's quiet chambers. It did not demand requital to exist. It simply was, a river flowing onward, carving canyons of depth in the landscape of a life. In the days that followed, Elias continued his walks, his gaze lingering on Miriam's window with a softened longing. The unrequited flame burned low, not in torment, but in a poetic glow that illuminated the beauty of what could never be. For in the autumn of his years, he had learned that some loves were meant to be felt, not held, echoes in the hollow, profound and eternal. The wind carried a sharper bite as November settled over Eldridge Hollow, wrapping the town in a quilt of frost and fading light. Elias, now 65, felt the season's chill seep into his bones, a reminder of time's relentless march. His walks along the cobblestone paths had grown slower, his cane tapping a rhythm that matched the quiet cadence of his thoughts. The house on Willow Lane still stood as his sentinel, its creaking beams a chorus to his solitude, but the ache for Miriam had softened into something else, a tender reverence, like the glow of a lantern left burning in a window for no one in particular. Miriam's garden, now dusted with the first frost, lay dormant, its herbs tucked beneath blankets of earth. She had taken to painting, her kitchen table strewn with watercolors and brushes, her hands stained with hues of sapphire and ochre. Elias would see her through her window, her head bent over a canvas, her expression a quiet dance of focus and release. He admired her from afar, not with the fevered longing of before, but with a poet's appreciation for beauty that existed beyond possession. One evening, as the sky bruised purple and the stars began their vigil, Elias found himself at her gate. He carried no apples this time, only a small leather-bound volume of Dickinson's poems, its pages worn from years of his quiet devotion. He knocked and Miriam answered, her shawl slipping slightly from her shoulders, revealing the delicate curve of her collarbone, a detail Elias tucked into the archive of his heart. "Elias," she greeted, her voice warm as always, though threaded with a fatigue he hadn't noticed before. "Come in from the cold." They sat by her hearth, the fire crackling like whispered secrets. She offered him tea, but he declined, placing the book on the table between them. "I thought you might like this," he said, his voice steady but soft, like the rustle of leaves underfoot. Her words, they speak to the spaces we don't always name. Miriam's fingers traced the cover, her eyes alight with recognition. "Emily," she murmured, opening to a marked page where Elias had underlined. Asterisk, "The heart wants what it wants, or else it does not care." Asterisk, she read it aloud, her voice a fragile thread, and for a moment their gazes held. A silent conversation of souls who had known loss and yet persisted in their quiet orbits. "I've been painting the hollow," she said, gesturing to a canvas propped against the wall. It depicted the lane at dusk, the willows bowing under the weight of twilight, their branches woven with shades of longing and release. "It's how I see it now," she continued. "Not as it was, but as it is, beautiful in its fading." Elias felt the words stir something deep within him, a recognition of his own heart's shift. His love for her had not dimmed but transformed, like a river finding new paths through familiar valleys. It was no longer a plea for her heart but a quiet offering of his own, a gift that asked for nothing in return. "It's beautiful, Miriam," he said, and meant more than the painting. They spoke late into the night, of poetry, of seasons, of the way memory clings like frost to glass. When he rose to leave, she pressed the book back into his hands. "Keep it," she said, her smile a crescent moon. "It belongs with you." He nodded, understanding that some gifts were meant to be held, not given away. Outside, the air was sharp, the stars brighter for the cold. Elias walked home, the book heavy in his pocket, its weight a comfort. In the stillness of his parlor, he lit a single candle and opened to another of Dickinson's lines. Asterisk, "Hope is the thing with feathers, that perches in the soul." Asterisk, he smiled, the ache now a quiet companion, not of unrequited love, but of a heart that had learned to love in silence, in presence, in the poetry of simply being. The hollow slept under its frost, and Elias too found rest, not in the fulfillment of desire, but in the deep, introspective beauty of a love that had carved its own space within him, eternal as the stars above Willow Lane. As winter's breath descended upon Eldridge Hollow, blanketing the rooftops in a hush of snow, Elias turned 65 with little fanfare, a solitary toast by the fire, the flames reflecting in his eyes like distant memories. The paths he once wandered were now veiled in white, each step crunching softly, a reminder of fragility and persistence. His house on Willow Lane groaned under the weight of the season, its windows frosted with intricate patterns that mimicked the lace of unspoken dreams. Miriam's light across the lane burned steadily, a beacon in the encroaching dark. She had begun writing letters, not to him but to her past self, or perhaps to the husband whose shadow lingered in her quiet hours. Elias caught glimpses of her silhouette at her desk, quill in hand, her movements deliberate as if weaving spells from ink. He wondered at the words she chose, the emotions she poured onto paper, but he no longer yearned to read them. His love had evolved into a silent guardianship, a vigil kept from afar, profound in its restraint. One stormy afternoon, when the wind howled like a chorus of forgotten sorrows, a knock echoed through Elias's door. There stood Miriam, her coat dusted with snowflakes that melted like tears upon her cheeks. "The power's gone," she said, her voice a fragile note in the gale. "Might I wait it out here?" He ushered her in, the warmth of his hearth enveloping her like an old friend's embrace. They sat in the glow of candlelight, the room alive with shadows that danced like half-remembered waltzes. He brewed tea from leaves he had dried in summer, their aroma a bridge between seasons. "Tell me of your letters," he ventured, his tone light as falling snow, not probing but inviting. Miriam's eyes, deep pools of hazel flecked with gold, met his. "They're confessions," she replied softly. "To the girl I was, the path's not taken. Grief has a way of freezing time, Elias. But lately, I've felt it thaw just a little." Her words hung in the air, delicate as icicles, and in them, he heard an echo of his own heart's quiet surrender. They spoke of winters past, of blizzards that had isolated them, yet bound the hollow in shared resilience, of books that warmed the soul when the world grew cold. As the storm raged outside, Elias felt a subtle shift, not in her affection, but in the space between them, a closeness born of companionship, untainted by expectation. His love, once a flame that singed, now glowed like embers, sustaining without consuming. When the wind subsided and the power flickered back to life, Miriam rose, her hand lingering on his arm, a touch that spoke volumes in its brevity. "Thank you, Elias," she whispered, her smile a fragile bloom in the frost. He watched her cross the lane, her footprints marking a transient path in the snow, soon to be erased by the night's gentle fall. Alone again, Elias stood by the window, the candle's light casting his shadow long and thoughtful. Love, he mused, was a winter's tale, not always of hearths shared, but of solitary lights that pierced the dark, illuminating the beauty in endurance. It etched itself into the soul like frost on glass, intricate and ephemeral, yet enduring in its quiet depth. The hollow slumbered under its snowy veil, and Elias, with a heart attuned to the poetry of the unspoken, found peace in the subtle rhythms of a love that asked only to exist, profound as the silence after a storm. Spring crept into Eldridge Hollow with a tentative grace, as if testing the air for remnants of winter's grip. The snow had melted, leaving the cobblestone paths slick and gleaming, and the willows along the lane unfurled tender green buds, fragile as new promises. Elias, now in the quiet autumn of his 65th year, felt the season's renewal stir something within him. Not hope exactly, but a soft curiosity, like the first notes of a melody half remembered. His walks resumed their rhythm. His cane less a necessity now than a companion, its tap a counterpoint to the birdsong that wove through the morning mist. Miriam's garden had awakened, its herbs stretching toward the sun, their scent to quiet him to resilience. She had taken to leaving her windows open, and sometimes Elias caught strains of her humming, old folk tunes, wistful and unadorned, that seemed to carry the weight of years. Their encounters were gentle, woven into the fabric of the hollow, a wave as she pruned her rosemary, a shared glance when the postman lingered too long with gossip. Yet Elias no longer sought her gaze with the hunger of before. His love had settled into a deeper current, a riverbed smoothed by time, content to flow without breaking the surface. One April evening, as the sky blushed with the hues of a fading sunset, Miriam appeared at his door, a small parcel wrapped in brown paper in her hands. "I found this in the attic," she said, her voice carrying the lilt of discovery. "It's one of Henry's old journals. I thought you might want it." Henry, her late husband, had been Elias's friend, a scholar of romantic poetry whose laughter once filled the hollow's quiet corners. Elias took the parcel, his fingers brushing the paper as if it held more than ink and memory. They sat in his parlor, the journal open between them, its pages brittle but alive with Henry's looping script, notes on Shelley, musings on love's fleeting nature, sketches of the hollow's hills. Miriam read a passage aloud, her voice steady but threaded with a quiet ache. Asterisk, to love is to risk the heart's fracture, yet in its breaking we find its truest shape. Asterisk, she paused, her eyes meeting Elias's, and for a moment, the air held the weight of unspoken truths. I've been reading my own letters, she confessed, her fingers tracing the journal's edge. The ones I wrote to myself. They've helped me see. Not just what I lost, but what I still carry. Her words were a confession, not of love for him, but of a heart learning to bloom again, in its own time on its own terms. Elias listened. His own heart a quiet mirror, reflecting not jealousy but a profound gratitude for her presence, her persistence. Do you think, he ventured, his voice soft as the dusk outside, that love can be enough, even if it's only held in one's own heart? Miriam's smile was a slow dawn, her eyes holding his with a clarity that felt like absolution. I think it's the truest kind, Elias. It asks for nothing but to be felt. When she left, the journal remained on his table, a relic of connection that needed no reciprocation to hold meaning. Elias stood by his window, watching the last light fade, the hollow settling into its evening hush. Love, he thought, was not a possession but a state of being, a quiet song sung to the self, resonant in its solitude. It was the green of spring's first leaves, the weight of a friend's words, the ache of a heart that had learned to love without grasping. As the stars emerged, pinpricks of light in the vast canvas above, Elias felt the hollow breathe with him, its rhythms a poetry of endurance. His love for Miriam, unrequited yet undiminished, was a verse in that eternal poem, a whisper of spring deep and unspoken, blooming in the quiet chambers of his soul. Summer unfolded over Eldridge Hollow like a well-worn quilt, its warmth seeping into the earth and stirring the air with the hum of bees and the scent of blooming lavender. The cobblestone paths shimmered under the midday sun, and the willows along Willow Lane draped their branches in lush verdancy, casting dappled shadows that danced like fleeting thoughts. Elias, at 65, embraced the season's languor with a quiet acceptance, his walks now meandering through fields of wildflowers, his cane parting the grasses like a poet's pen through blank verse. The house stood sentinel as ever, its shutters open to the breeze, inviting in the symphony of cicadas that sang of time's inexorable cycle. Miriam's garden had burst into full splendor, a riot of colors, crimson poppies nodding beside azure delphiniums, their petals unfurling like secrets long held. She had begun hosting small gatherings, neighbors drawn to her porch for lemonade and stories, her laughter a light ripple across the lane. Elias observed from his window, not with envy, but with a gentle admiration. His love now a steady undercurrent, nourishing without demanding. It had become a part of him, like the lines etched by years on his hands, profound in its subtlety. One sultry July afternoon, as thunderheads gathered on the horizon, Elias crossed the lane with a jar of honey from the local apiary, its golden hue mirroring the sun's reluctant descent. Miriam welcomed him onto her porch, where wicker chairs creaked under their weight, and iced tea sweated beads of condensation. The heat brings everything to life, she said, fanning herself with a painted fan, its motifs of birds in flight a metaphor for freedom's grasped late. They spoke of summers past, of childhood rivers and lost ambitions, of how the season's fullness could mask the quiet voids within. As the first raindrops pattered on the leaves, Miriam shared a sketch from her notebook, a portrait of the hollow at noon, the light fierce and unforgiving, yet revealing hidden contours in the landscape. I've been drawing what I feel, not just what I see, she confided, her voice a soft murmur against the storm's approach. Elias traced the lines with his gaze, seeing in them echoes of his own heart, illuminated, exposed, yet unclaimed. It captures the essence, he replied, his words carrying the weight of unspoken parallels. The way light reveals without altering. The rain intensified, a curtain veiling the world beyond the porch, and in that intimate enclosure, Elias felt the pull of vulnerability. Miriam, he began, his voice blending with the downpour. These seasons we've shared, they've taught me that love isn't a harvest to reap, but a seed that grows in its own soil. Her eyes, softened by the gray light, held his with a warmth that was kindred, not kindled. And sometimes, she added gently, it flourishes best when left to the wild. Her hand rested near his on the armrest, a proximity that spoke of comfort, not convergence. When the storm passed, leaving the air cleansed and the hollow glistening, Miriam walked him to the gate. "Thank you for the honey," she said, her smile a ray breaking through clouds. Elias returned home, the jar's sweetness a faint echo in his palm. In the evening's hush, he sat by his open window, the breeze carrying faint strains of her neighbors' voices, a reminder of lives intertwining in ways his did not. Love, he reflected, was a summer's tale, of abundance observed from the shade, of warmth felt in solitude, carving rivers of depth through the soul's parched earth. As fireflies began their luminous ballet in the twilight, Elias closed his eyes, the hollow's heartbeat syncing with his own. His unrequited affection, bathed in the season's glow, was no longer a shadow but a light within, poetic, introspective, eternally blooming in the quiet garden of his being. Autumn returned to Eldridge Hollow with a familiar whisper, the leaves turning to gold and russet as if the trees themselves were shedding the weight of another year. The air carried a crispness that spoke of cycles closing and beginnings veiled in mist, and the cobblestone paths crunched underfoot with fallen acorns, each one a small testament to time's quiet persistence. Elias, now 66, moved through the season with a grace honed by reflection. His steps measured, his gaze attuned to the subtle shifts in light and shadow. The house on Willow Lane, with its weathered facade and chimney puffing faint smoke, felt like an old companion, holding the echoes of seasons past within its walls. Miriam's garden, having yielded its summer bounty, now prepared for rest, its vines curling inward like fingers clasping memories. She had taken up knitting, her porch adorned with skeins of wool in shades of earth and sky, her needles clicking a rhythmic counterpoint to the hollow's hush. Elias watched her from afar, his love a settled ember, glowing without the need for kindling. It had become a quiet ritual, this unspoken bond, a nod across the lane, a shared silence that held more depth than words. One golden afternoon, as the sun slanted low, casting long shadows that stretched like yearning arms, Elias ventured to her door with a bouquet of asters gathered from the wild edges of the hollow. Their purple petals, resilient against the encroaching chill, mirrored the enduring hue of his affection. Miriam opened the door, her eyes lighting with a warmth that was genuine, if not ignited by the same flame. "Elias, how lovely," she said, her voice a gentle breeze through the leaves. They sat in her sunroom, the glass panes framing the autumn vista, tea steaming between them like shared breath. She spoke of her knitting, a scarf for a distant niece, patterns inspired by the hollow's winding paths. "It's a way to weave the present with what came before," she mused, her fingers pausing on the yarn. Elias nodded, his own hands cradling the cup, feeling the heat seep into his skin. He shared a memory of his youth, of autumn fairs and lost loves glimpsed in crowds, stories that danced around the edges of his heart's truth without naming it. In the quiet pauses, he felt the weight of what remained unsaid, not as a burden, but as a cherished verse in an ongoing poem. As the light faded, Miriam unfolded a small square of fabric from her basket, a handkerchief embroidered with willow branches, their leaves in delicate thread. "For you," she offered, placing it in his palm, "a token of the lane we share." The gesture was simple, a bridge of friendship spanning the chasm of his deeper longing. Elias accepted it, the cloth soft against his skin, a tangible echo of her presence. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice laced with the poetry of gratitude. He left as dusk enveloped the hollow, the asters now arranged in her vase, their scent lingering in the air. Back in his parlor, Elias unfolded the handkerchief, tracing the stitches with a finger, each one a subtle thread in the tapestry of his soul. Love, he pondered by the fire's glow, was an autumn harvest, not always gathered, but appreciated in its ripeness, in the colors that blazed before falling. It was the quiet acceptance of what bloomed and what lay fallow, profound in its cycle of release. The hollow sighed into night, the wind stirring leaves in a nocturnal ballet, and Elias, with a heart attuned to the season's subtle song, embraced the beauty of a love that endured unspoken, eternal as the turning of the earth. Winter returned to Eldridge Hollow with a quiet ferocity, draping the world in a mantle of snow that muffled sound and sharpened silence. The cobblestone paths vanished under drifts, and the willows stood sentinel, their bare branches etched against a sky heavy with the promise of more storms. Elias, at 66, felt the cold settle deeper into his joints, a reminder of time's patient carving, yet his spirit remained buoyant, warmed by the ember of a love that had grown roots in his solitude. His house on Willow Lane creaked in the wind, its hearth a small defiance against the season's grip, the firelight casting shadows that danced like memories across the walls. Miriam's home glowed across the lane, its windows aglow with the soft flicker of candles, a sanctuary against the dark. She had taken to crafting small wooden carvings, birds and leaves whittled with a precision that spoke of hours spent in quiet contemplation. Elias glimpsed her at work through the frost-laced glass, her hands steady, her face softened by focus, and he marveled at how she shaped beauty from stillness. Their interactions had settled into a rhythm as natural as the seasons. A wave through the snow, a brief exchange of firewood or bread, moments that wove them together without entwining. On a late January evening, when the snow fell in thick, silent curtains, Elias trudged across the lane, a basket of kindling tucked under his arm, the handkerchief Miriam had given him folded in his pocket like a talisman. She welcomed him in, her cheeks flushed from the hearth's warmth, her carving knife paused over a half-formed sparrow. "You're a brave soul in this storm," she said, her smile a spark in the dimness. They sat by her fire, the crackle of burning logs a counterpoint to the wind's low moan, and shared a pot of mulled cider, its spice filling the air with memories of warmer days. Miriam spoke of her carvings, each one a tribute to moments she held dear. A sparrow for the morning Henry proposed, a leaf for the autumn they moved to the hollow. "It's my way of keeping them close," she said, her voice a thread of melancholy woven with peace. Elias listened, his heart a quiet mirror, reflecting her resolve in his own unspoken devotion. He shared a story of a winter long ago, when he'd wandered a frozen lake, skating alone under a starlit sky, chasing a freedom he only later understood as love's elusive shape. "Some things," he murmured, "we hold most dearly when we let them glide free." Her eyes met his, clear and unguarded, and for a moment, the space between them felt like a shared breath, fragile yet profound. She reached for the sparrow carving, its wings half-formed, and placed it in his hands. "For you," she said softly, "for the stories you carry." The wood was smooth, warm from her touch, and Elias felt the weight of her gesture. Not a declaration, but a recognition, a bridge of kinship spanning the quiet distance of his unrequited longing. As he left, the snow swirled around him, each flake a fleeting note in winter's silent symphony. Back in his parlor, Elias set the sparrow on his mantle, its unfinished wings a testament to love's incomplete beauty. He sat by the fire, the handkerchief unfolded beside him, its willow stitches glowing in the flickering light. Love, he reflected, was a winter's verse, not a blaze to conquer the cold, but a single flame, steadfast in its glow, warming the soul through the long dark. The hollow lay still under its snowy shroud, and Elias, with a heart tuned to the poetry of endurance, found solace in a love that needed no echo to resonate, eternal as the quiet fall of snow. Spring bloomed in Eldridge Hollow with a quiet exuberance, the earth awakening in bursts of color and song, as if shaking off winter's introspective slumber. The cobblestone paths emerged from their snowy veil, slick with rain and dotted with puddles that mirrored the budding sky. Willows along the lane unfurled tender leaves, their green a promise of renewal, and the air hummed with the tentative calls of returning birds. Elias, still 66, greeted the season with a measured optimism, his joints eased by the warmer days, his walks regaining a lilt that echoed the hollow's reviving pulse. His house on Willow Lane breathed easier, windows thrown open to invite the breeze, carrying scents of damp soil and fresh possibility. Miriam's garden stirred to life once more, shoots pushing through the soil with determined grace, her hands now guiding vines along trellises and sowing seeds of forget-me-nots, tiny blue blooms that whispered of memory and constancy. She had begun composing short verses, scribbling them on scraps of paper amid her planting, her words capturing the fleeting beauty of petals and dew. Elias caught sight of her in the mornings, bent over her notebook, her copper-silver hair catching the sun like a halo, and he felt his love as a gentle tide, ebbing and flowing with the seasons, profound in its persistence without possession. One mild April morning, as mist lingered in the hollow like a lover's sigh, Elias crossed the lane with a sparrow carving in his pocket and a small sheaf of wild violets gathered from the wood's edge. Their purple hearts seemed fitting, resilient, and unassuming. Miriam was in her garden, knees dusted with earth, and she rose to greet him, her smile a dawn breaking through clouds. "Elias, join me," she invited, gesturing to a bench beneath the blooming cherry tree, its petals drifting like soft snow. They sat amid the falling blossoms, the air sweet with their fragrance, and Miriam shared one of her verses. In spring's embrace, the heart unfolds, petals of what was and dreams untold. Her voice wove through the petals, a melody of reflection, and Elias felt it resonate within him, a mirror to his own silent poetry. He placed the violets in her lap, their stems tied with a simple ribbon. "For your garden of words," he said softly, his eyes holding hers with a depth that spoke volumes unspoken. She touched the flowers, her fingers lingering, and in return, offered him a folded paper, a poem about the hollow stream, its waters carrying secrets downstream. "It's not much," she murmured, "but it's from the thaw within." Elias accepted it, the paper warm from her hand, a token that bridged their separate shores without merging them. They spoke of renewal, of how spring coaxed life from dormancy, how hearts, too, could find fresh paths amid familiar landscapes. The conversation flowed like the stream she described, meandering yet meaningful, laced with subtle undercurrents of shared understanding. As petals continued to fall, veiling their shoulders in white, Elias rose, the sparrow carving returned to his pocket, a companion in his quiet vigil. "Thank you for the morning," he said, his voice a gentle farewell. Miriam nodded, her gaze following him across the lane, a softness there that was appreciation, not ardor. In his parlor that evening, Elias unfolded the poem, its lines etching themselves into his soul like rain on parched earth. Love, he mused by the window, watching the cherry blossoms whirl in the breeze, was a springtime sonnet, not a claiming of the bloom, but a celebration of its unfolding, felt deeply in the observer's heart. It was the violet's quiet resilience, the petal's graceful descent, carving spaces of beauty in the soul's renewing garden. The hollow basked in spring's light, and Elias, attuned to its poetic rhythms, embraced a love that flourished in subtlety, eternal as the cycle of growth and grace. Spring bloomed in Eldridge Hollow with a quiet exuberance, the earth awakening in bursts of color and song, as if shaking off winter's introspective slumber. The cobblestone paths emerged from their snowy veil, slick with rain and dotted with puddles that mirrored the budding sky. Willows along the lane unfurled tender leaves, their green a promise of renewal, and the air hummed with the tentative calls of returning birds. Elias, still 66, greeted the season with a measured optimism, his joints eased by the warmer days, his walks regaining a lilt that echoed the hollow's reviving pulse. His house on Willow Lane breathed easier, windows thrown open to invite the breeze, carrying scents of damp soil and fresh possibility. Miriam's garden stirred to life once more, shoots pushing through the soil with determined grace, her hands now guiding vines along trellises and sowing seeds of forget-me-nots, tiny blue blooms that whispered of memory and constancy. She had begun composing short verses, scribbling them on scraps of paper amid her planting, her words capturing the fleeting beauty of petals and dew. Elias caught sight of her in the mornings, bent over her notebook, her copper-silver hair catching the sun like a halo, and he felt his love as a gentle tide, ebbing and flowing with the seasons, profound in its persistence without possession. One mild April morning, as mist lingered in the hollow like a lover's sigh, Elias crossed the lane with a sparrow carving in his pocket and a small sheaf of wild violets gathered from the wood's edge. Their purple hearts seemed fitting, resilient, and unassuming. Miriam was in her garden, knees dusted with earth, and she rose to greet him, her smile a dawn breaking through clouds. "Elias, join me," she invited, gesturing to a bench beneath the blooming cherry tree, its petals drifting like soft snow. They sat amid the falling blossoms, the air sweet with their fragrance, and Miriam shared one of her verses. Asterisk, in spring's embrace, the heart unfolds, slash petals of what was and dreams untold. Asterisk, her voice wove through the petals, a melody of reflection, and Elias felt it resonate within him, a mirror to his own silent poetry. He placed the violets in her lap, their stems tied with a simple ribbon. "For your garden of words," he said softly, his eyes holding hers with a depth that spoke volumes unspoken. She touched the flowers, her fingers lingering, and in return, offered him a folded paper, a poem about the hollow's stream, its waters carrying secrets downstream. "It's not much," she murmured, "but it's from the thaw within." Elias accepted it, the paper warm from her hand, a token that bridged their separate shores without merging them. They spoke of renewal, of how spring coaxed life from dormancy, how hearts, too, could find fresh paths amid familiar landscapes. The conversation flowed like the stream she described, meandering yet meaningful, laced with subtle undercurrents of shared understanding. As petals continued to fall, veiling their shoulders in white, Elias rose. The sparrow carving returned to his pocket, a companion in his quiet vigil. "Thank you for the morning," he said, his voice a gentle farewell. Miriam nodded, her gaze following him across the lane, a softness there that was appreciation, not ardor. In his parlor that evening, Elias unfolded the poem, its lines etching themselves into his soul like rain on parched earth. Love, he mused by the window, watching the cherry blossoms whirl in the breeze, was a springtime sonnet, not a claiming of the bloom, but a celebration of its unfolding, felt deeply in the observer's heart. It was the violet's quiet resilience, the petal's graceful descent, carving spaces of beauty in the soul's renewing garden. The hollow basked in spring's light, and Elias, attuned to its poetic rhythms, embraced a love that flourished in subtlety, eternal as the cycle of growth and grace. Summer enveloped Eldridge Hollow in a golden haze, the sun lingering long into the evenings, painting the sky in strokes of lavender and rose. The cobblestone paths warmed underfoot, and the willows swayed lazily, their leaves a verdant canopy whispering secrets to the breeze. Elias, still 66, navigated the season's languid heat with a contemplative ease, his walks extending into the twilight hours, his cane a steady companion amid the chorus of crickets and fireflies. His house on Willow Lane basked in the light, doors ajar to catch the crosswinds, the air infused with the distant hum of life unfolding. Miriam's garden thrived in abundance, overflowing with ripe tomatoes and fragrant basil, her hands now turning to preserving, jars of jams and pickles lining her shelves, each one a capsule of summer's fleeting essence. She had begun humming folk songs while she worked, her voice carrying across the lane like a gentle current, evoking memories of festivals and forgotten joys. Elias listened from his porch, his love a warm underglow, sustained by these glimpses, profound in its unvoiced depth, no longer a yearning but a serene acceptance. One balmy July evening, as the sun dipped low, casting elongated shadows that merged with the hollow's contours, Elias crossed the lane with a small basket of wild berries, their deep hues stained from the afternoon's harvest. Miriam was on her porch, stirring a pot of simmering fruit, the air thick with the sweet tang of strawberry preserves. "Elias, perfect timing," she called, her eyes sparkling with the day's labor. They sat at her table, the jam cooling in bowls, spoons dipping into the ruby mixture, a shared ritual under the fading light. She spoke of her preserves, each jar labeled with dates and notes, reminders of rains that nourished or suns that ripened. "It's like bottling time," she said, her voice a melody blending with the evening's song. Elias nodded, tasting the sweetness on his tongue, and recounted a tale of childhood summers, of berry-picking adventures that taught him the patience of waiting for ripeness. In the quiet lulls, he felt the essence of his affection, not as a demand, but as a quiet offering like the berries he brought, given freely, savored in the moment. Miriam offered him a jar, its lid sealed with wax, a ribbon tied around its neck. "For your winter mornings," she said softly, her hand brushing his in the exchange. The touch was fleeting, a spark in the dusk, and Elias held the jar close, its warmth echoing the subtle flame within him. They watched the fireflies emerge, points of light winking in the gathering dark, a silent symphony of ephemeral beauty. He departed as stars pricked the sky, the basket lighter, the jar a weight of quiet connection. In his parlor, Elias placed it on the windowsill, where moonlight caught its glow. Love, he contemplated, was a summer's preserve, not consumed in haste, but savored in seasons to come, its sweetness distilled from moments unclaimed. It was the firefly's brief luminescence, the berry's ripe yield, etching joy into the soul's enduring harvest. The hollow hummed into night, alive with the pulse of summer, and Elias, harmonious with its poetic flow, cherished a love that bloomed in restraint, timeless as the stars overhead. Autumn returned once more to Eldridge Hollow, its arrival a soft requiem, the leaves surrendering in cascades of amber and crimson, as if the trees themselves exhaled the year's accumulated sighs. The cobblestone paths lay strewn with their fallen glory, crunching under Elias's measured steps like the brittle pages of an ancient book. At 66, he carried the weight of seasons past in the slight stoop of his shoulders, yet his eyes held a clarity forged from introspection, his heart a repository of unspoken verses. The house on Willow Lane stood resilient, its chimney smoke curling upward like prayers released into the ether, mingling with the mist that cloaked the hollow in ethereal veils. Miriam's garden had quieted, its blooms retreating into the soil, leaving only hardy chrysanthemums to defy the chill, their petals a defiant burst of color against the graying landscape. She moved with a deliberate slowness now, her copper-silver hair bound in a loose braid, her days filled with rereading old letters and tending to a small collection of pressed flowers, mementos of gardens long gone. Elias observed her with a love that had transcended longing, becoming instead a profound harmony, a silent symphony played on the strings of memory and acceptance. Their encounters were sparse but meaningful, a shared glance over the fence, a nod that conveyed volumes in its subtlety. One crisp October twilight, as the sun bled into the horizon in strokes of molten gold, Elias crossed the lane for what he sensed might be the last time, a single red maple leaf tucked into his pocket like a final stanza. Miriam was on her porch, wrapped in a woolen shawl, her eyes distant, as if gazing into the hollow's hidden depths. "Elias," she greeted, her voice a whisper carried on the wind. They sat side by side, the air scented with wood smoke and fading earth, and spoke not of the past or future, but of the present, the way the light lingered on the willows, the quiet grace of leaves in descent. In the hush, Elias felt the culmination of his affection, not as a crescendo, but as a gentle resolution. "Miriam," he said softly, "in all these turnings of the earth, you've been the constant star in my quiet sky." Her hand found his, a clasp of companionship, her smile tender with the wisdom of years. "And you, dear friend, the steady path beneath my feet." No more was needed. The words hung between them like the last light of day, illuminating without altering the landscape of their hearts. As darkness enveloped the hollow, Elias returned home, the leaf in his pocket a symbol of release. That night, by the fire's dying embers, he closed his eyes, his breath sinking with the wind's sigh, and slipped into a peaceful slumber from which he did not wake. Love, in its final verse, had carried him gently onward, a river meeting the sea. ###epilogue. Years wove their threads through Eldridge Hollow, the seasons cycling in eternal rhythm, the cobblestone paths worn smoother by time's patient tread. Miriam, now in her 70s, still tended her garden, though its scale had diminished to a few cherished pots on the porch. The house across the lane stood empty for a time, then welcomed new voices, a young family whose laughter echoed like fresh echoes in an old tale. She often sat by her window, gazing at the willows that bowed in the breeze, remembering Elias with a fondness deepened by absence. In his absence, she had come to recognize the quiet depth of his devotion, a love that had asked nothing yet given everything, a beacon that illuminated her own path through grief and renewal. On quiet evenings, she would unfold the poems and tokens he had left behind, their words a bridge to a bond unspoken yet unbreakable. The hollow endured, its beauty in the subtle interplay of light and shadow, life and loss. And in its heart Elias's love lingered, not as a shadow of unrequital, but as a poetic essence woven into the very air, a testament to the profound grace of a heart that loved deeply, eternally in silence.